Cool. Okay. So we're off. Welcome to Tim Woodall. Thank you very much for joining me. Really, really appreciate it. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, Johnny. It's a privilege to be here and looking forward to our conversation. So thanks for the opportunity.
Excellent stuff. Sounds like you're coping well with the lockdown, although juggling kind of family responsibilities at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. We've got it's 10 months today. So juggling that, childcare. Well, lockdown's ended now, which is good. But yeah, I think the balancing act will continue certainly for the next few months.
It feels like it's kind of ended.
Well, there's a pub right on the corner here, and their tables are back up and they're back serving. So that's a bit of a visible sign for me that there's a bit of a shift. But yeah, apart from that, it doesn't feel like a lot's changed.
Excellent stuff. Well, it's good. Well, it's good to see that at least. Yeah, hopefully positive things moving forward. So anyway, we've got loads of stuff to talk about. With the kind of main emphasis of our discussion being around outcome-based working models, and in particular how the different elements of HR, procurement, and operations align when you're looking at these types of models. And I know you've got a great visibility on different aspects of that, particularly in what you're doing right at the moment. Before we get into it, I just thought it'd be useful if we could go into a little bit of background, firstly on what you do, but also on kind of your journey, how you got there, what your experience has been kind of leading up to this around this industry, because I know you've been in the industry for quite a while.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, I'm working for Capita People Solutions, and that's a division of Capita that takes all of our HR products and services out to the customer base, whether that's resourcing, learning, or pensions or HR shared services. And in particular remit, looking at what is the value proposition and how do we have digital HR tech products embedded in those offerings. So, looking at what is the tech landscape and how do we partner with that and bring the best of that to our customers. So really interesting. And I think like most people, I probably ended up in this industry totally by accident. I originally started in procurement, which is perhaps why I'm quite interested in the SoW piece. Ended up being responsible for managing a contingent workforce that probably previously didn't have a structure, and then jumped onto the supplier side, and I've been there for the rest of my career mostly. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey, and sort of statement of work and outcome-based work is, it's always been one of those topics, but I think now it's something whose time has come. So definitely a very timely conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that its time has come. It's been something that's kind of been bubbling away for the last few years. You've had people like staffing industry analysts, Spend Matters, people like that talking about it and kind of talking about it bubbling along. But now it seems very clear that it's kind of, it's actually really happening now. It's important. It's current. In the UK, you've got things like R35 and Brexit and COVID obviously influencing that drive towards outcome-based services. But I think globally, we're starting to see much more activity around this, and much more in the way of procurement departments or large organizations looking at their services spend and saying, what are we doing? How much are we spending? What are we getting for our money? How are we measuring it? It definitely seems to be pretty current.
Absolutely, and I think it's interesting because, as I say, it's all something whose time has come. But from a supplier side, which is where I've been most of my career, it's always been a case of trying to stimulate the market, and that's just a reflection of the commercial models and the fact that the spend that typically exists in an outcome-based world is much more than a typical contingent program. So there's a natural incentive to go after it, but it feels that we're on a journey from having to do a lot of education as to why it's sensible to manage work in that way to now, okay, yeah, we get that. And how do we actually make that happen? And how do we move forward?
Yeah, and it's very interesting when you start getting into the detail of where that sits within an organization. Obviously, with some of the stuff that you've done previously, it's been probably more contingent workforce focused, would you say?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
And I think you can look at it and say, well, there's contingent workforce on the one hand and there's services procurement on the other, but there are definitely some kind of grey areas where there's crossover, and I think that's where things like, for example, IR35 is driving a lot of interest in statement of work and that as a kind of output model.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, how have you seen that kind of shift over the period of your career?
Well, I think a lot of the initial programs I'm involved in had this as a component of the program. The biggest driver wasn't necessarily a procurement function that was actively managing that spend or actively had a category strategy around that. A lot of the driver was coming we need the visibility of who those workers are. primarily because we need to control their IT access or we need to control site access. And therefore we need them in a BMS or a system of record because we need to know who they are and which supplier they're working for and who's responsible for them within the business. And almost in terms of what was the billing structure that sat behind that was in many cases a secondary afterthought that, oh, actually, yeah, we could actually do that. I think often a lot of these programs I see procurement trying to own them, but it's been this big struggle, I think, for procurement often to get their hands around it, because whereas a contingent workforce program, you know, in the UK, almost every company of any size or scale has had a contingent workforce management program for a while and are on a second or third generation. That's rarely been the case where you go into an organization and you find that the statement of work is a truly managed program. And I think that's been part of procurement's struggle, is how do they get their hands around that? Because often it's not been centralized enough, or it's been very dispersed. And also it's a very difficult area of the business to engage with. You know, I think that's an area where there's most active resistance to procurement coming in and saying, we want to manage this, because there's the executive relationships, there's, you know, relationships with suppliers that, you know, business and hiring managers don't necessarily want disrupted. So I think a lot of the struggle over the last few years, and perhaps the reason that a lot of this hasn't got the traction that it has up until now, has been because procurement hasn't necessarily gone and been able to articulate a way they can add value to the business beyond just visibility and perhaps some tactical onboarding support.
Yeah, I think it's some really interesting points there. I think the point you initially made about one of the drivers being kind of very worker led in terms of identification, individual kind of worker tracking. So if you've got Accenture doing a project, you know, who from Accenture is in your building, who's got rights, access rights, and, you know, maybe internet rights or IT access rights, whatever that might be. You've kind of got that scenario versus, and that kind of very much almost transitioning from a contingent workforce mentality across to, on the other hand, what we see is some scenarios where it's very much you know, we're spending 100 million a year on services procurement. What's going on with it? What are we actually getting for our money? What are the results that we're getting from that? And I think there's a lot of frustration around being able to actually measure that. Frustration in the C-suite, but also frustration within procurement. As you say, for people, it's difficult to get their arms around it. There's resistance, it's diffused within the organization. Quite often you've got a long tail where you may have like hidden headcount and rogue spend going on, which is quite hard to manage, or has traditionally been quite hard to manage. So I think there are different angles from which people are coming at it, and it will depend on company size, structure, culture. You know, in some organizations, the challenge for procurement might be, we just don't tell people what to do. It's just not the culture of the organization. Right. And we see that even in some really big organizations where it's quite surprising. But in other organizations, it's very much a case of, if procurement can get their hands around it, if they can get the right processes and systems and, you know, the seat at the table to get this under control, then, you know, there will be mandates and there will be set processes that they need people to go through. But in theory, that should then provide a better experience for the end user, in the sense that they'll be using the best suppliers, getting the best results out of them. And, you know, the overall contribution to the business will be much easier to measure and recognize.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And I think, you know, IR35, and we can touch on that, is going to be a driver of that. But not only that, the wider economic situation and budgets being hugely under pressure, and obviously the financial outlook for next year is really uncertain. And if you are an organization that's, say, spending 100 million on consultants, if you could even save 10% of that, and, you know, if the program hasn't been centrally managed today, I think that's not necessarily an unrealistic target. Who doesn't want to book that sort of saving, regardless of whether it's procurement or the CFO or the wider organization? So I think the IR35 helps a lot in that, but I think it's also going to be an economic imperative to look at, almost every organization is going to have to look at cost savings, or they are already, for their financial planning for next year. And this is one area where it's a very quick to be able to manage that spend. It's not like you've got 2-3 year contracts that have to run out and you have to redo those contracts. You can impact the overall spend and the type of spend fairly quickly if you start managing it correctly.
Yeah, and there's, as you say, there's huge savings to be made. I mean, even if you've got services procurement happening where it's not generally going through a competitive bidding process, for example, even that you'd expect to save maybe on 20% on average by putting it through a competitive bidding process. I think there's also organizations are taking much more of an interest in the sort of the agility of their supply chain. So they might want to focus on a particular area in their supply chain where they're looking at sustainability, or they're looking at particular factors that they want to have within their supply chain, but also just the kind of the resilience of their supply chain and the options they have within it. If they're just kind of using the same people all the time, not questioning it and not actually taking through any kind of process, there's lots of input that procurement could add to that, which enriches that whole kind of network of suppliers that they've got and their interactions with those suppliers. I think you're right. IR35 it's a good catalyst. It's a very good catalyst. It's a clear thing that's happening, and it's driving a switch to a certain extent from some work being delivered via PSC contractors to that work being looked at delivering under an outcome basis. You've also got Brexit, as I've mentioned before on previous podcasts, where I think it's almost like a little bit overlooked in terms of the potential effect that has on the appetite for companies to outsource work. And I think that's something, I don't know if that's something that's kind of, customers that you guys deal with are talking about that much.
No, I was really intrigued when it came up in a previous conversation with you, Johnny, because today, if we are seeing it, it's not necessarily being specifically attributed to Brexit, that being an impact, but in terms of the way you've laid it out as a potential impact, I definitely think that's an issue. I think there's one other thing I'd throw in the mix as well, which is as a result of COVID, is the general transition to remote work, and I think that's actually going to aid a more of a transition to outcome-based work, because it's going to be less about who's coming into the office. And if I've got a team of consultants coming into the office, I can see that they're there during the day, and yes, I can make a tick in terms of, they know they work that number of hours. With that work, I think perhaps increasingly happening remotely, certainly for the foreseeable future, in an organization, I'm not necessarily going to have the visibility in terms of, did they work a full day? And I think that's going to drive the sort of a shift as well to thinking about, actually, I want to pay around the outcomes, and I want to focus around the outcomes rather than understanding, when do they log on and what hours do they log on? So I think that could also impact it as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it also comes back to looking at this kind of issue of worker tracking and kind of coming at it from the perspective of a sort of a worker mentality. And I think that I see these kind of two different approaches. One where people are very contingent workforce minded, and it's almost like an add-on to their contingent workforce issues at the moment that they're transitioning across to deal with, and IR35 is pushing this transition of the way work gets done. But sometimes that still feels to me like a contingent workforce mentality, still talking about workers. And I totally appreciate when people are saying, well, if I'm having consultants coming on site, or subcontractors, suppliers coming on site, I need to know who they are, because they need building access, we need to have security control over it, etc. But ultimately, when people get into a real kind of services procurement mindset, they're thinking about an outcome, and to a certain extent, it doesn't matter who's doing it. And that's kind of like the other end of the scale, where people are saying, I just need a piece of work done. It doesn't matter who's doing it. The supplier is going to get it done for me. They're agreeing to these milestones and these deliverables and these outputs. It's up to them how they get it done, as long as they do it on time and to the quality and to the scope that I want. So it's interesting to kind of see that dynamic going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that, I agree. Then that probably reflects which individuals are involved or which department is running. I agree that that's two different ways of looking at it. And the second approach that you laid out, I think is rarer to see, but it is the right way to go. But there are organisations that are doing it. In previous life, I've worked with an oil and gas major, and they had every supplier, every statement of work supplier running through the system, and then they were scoring every project that was done. And then they would review the scores with each of the suppliers. And if you had 2 or 3 projects that didn't meet a certain score, you then dropped off the list for eligibility for bidding for future projects for a predetermined period of time. So that type of mentality, or those type of case studies, perhaps need to be amplified and perhaps wider articulated and understood within the industry, that it is possible to do that. Because I think also part of the challenge is, how do I articulate and how do I write down the outcome that I want? And I think sometimes that's been a struggle for even for the businesses to articulate. I need you to come in and do some strategy. Okay, well, what's the actual outcome, or what are the outputs that I want to write down on paper? And either you end up with outputs that aren't really too meaningful and are just sort of there to tick a box, or it just defaults back to T&M. And I think that's where the industry's got to continue to evolve beyond that, because IR35 will blow a hole in potentially both of those models as well.
Yeah, and I think that is the continuing education part of the process that we're in at the moment. I mean, if you look at most organisations, pardon me, in most organisations, they really struggle to get people to write good job descriptions. Just a standard T&M, it's really, really hard to get people to write good job specs. So when you're trying to wrap work up package it up into an actual fixed deliverable, that's a whole different ball game altogether. But actually, it's a really pragmatic exercise, a very useful exercise for an organisation or a department to do, because ultimately, it's in a lot of ways, it can be a much more efficient way of working if it's in the right scenario. I always say it's horses for courses in terms of whether it's best for a permanent employee, contractor, internal team, external supplier, whatever it might be, statement of work, it's horses for courses, whatever the best resourcing model is for that to get that objective completed. But, if you're really understanding what it is you want to get done in the first place, I think you need to have flexibility in the way that is then managed. There are always going to be changes. Yeah. There are going to be changes through the bidding process. As a technology provider, that's something that is really interesting to us, just in terms of how much flexibility there needs to be within the system. You need to have structure. You need to take people through a workflow. But we always kind of take the approach that we don't dictate the specific flow for an organization. We try and support the workflow that is most effective for them. Because some people might need more flexibility around milestones. They might need milestones to be sprints, for example, in some cases in an agile methodology. Yeah. Or you might need to have these kind of iterative changes, make a lot of use of change requests, but you need to track it all and agree it all and make sure it's auditable. So I think there's always going to be flexibility. And, as I say, as a tech provider, we have to be good at doing the tech, but we also have to be good at making it work for different people, because everybody seems to do this differently. And in terms of the different approaches that organizations take, would you say there's any pattern that you see in terms of the different approaches to managing this type of work fitting into any particular type of industry or other kind of business size or anything like that you can kind of really pick out?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's a consistent trend by industry. I know most industries like to think they have a specific way of doing things, but I'm not really convinced. Certainly in sort of the HR external workforce world, that there's some nuances, but in general, I wouldn't say, certainly in terms of looking across our customer base and looking at what our customers are doing, that there's sort of trends that are specific to the industry. I think it very much depends on the organization, and it depends on the type of work. And coming back to sort of a previous point we touched on, it depends who's owning that initiative within the company. And going back to your paradigm of whether it's contingent or whether it's not or not. The one organization that we haven't really talked about that can often have a key role is finance.
Right.
And I think for me, one of the big impacts is whether finance is involved in the process. Because a lot of the way I think that the statement of work programs often fall down is because they haven't pre-engaged finance, or finance haven't necessarily been engaged in the correct way. And then what you typically see is that the program then becomes a lot of admin work around, to your point about tech having the flexibility. They end up having to do additional processes outside of the tech and that's because the processes in most cases haven't been engineered correctly because finance haven't been brought in. So a classic example of, maybe you still require purchase orders or goods received notices. Well, actually, you can remove a lot of that if you design the processes and get the approvals up front and understand exactly what work's been engaged and who signed that off. Or I see a lot of situations, I see a lot of programs where they use the VMS or whatever the system is being used to manage statement of work almost to reconcile manual supplier invoices. And then there's always sort of work that has to go on before the invoice can then be sent to finance and payment, where there's automated solutions that are a core part of the technology to support those processes, but they haven't been able to be deployed. And to me, I think when I look at sort of what are the trends are, it's whether a key one in terms of an indicator of success is whether finance are a key stakeholder or not.
Yeah, as you say, if you're trying to put processes and technology and automate, the end-to-end kind of source to pay process as much as possible, it kind of defeats the object if you're having to step out and take on manual processes.
Exactly.
But in terms of what you're talking about with regards to finance buy-in, are you talking about that from a systems point of view, or from a? Just want to go into that in a little bit more depth, really, because something that we see quite a lot is clearly a very important part of the process is how invoices are managed, how payments are managed, and all that sort of thing. Whether it's a recruitment intermediary, an MSP managing it for a client, or whether it's a client running the process directly. So that might include, for example, whatever you're using to manage whatever technology you're using to manage your SoW process will need to then interface with your finance system, whether that's a flat file export, an API integration, or maybe just emails pinging out to a finance system or to a finance team. So is that what you're referring to in terms of the managing the invoicing part of the process, or is it just in terms of the kind of solution design element of it, where if you got finance involved in the first place, then there'd be a lot less problems when you go to roll it out?
I think a large part of it is solution design, but I think it's wider than that, because I think finance often have really strong relationships with the business, and having them be brought into why you're doing it, and then also championing why you're doing it, I think can make a huge difference to the program. Finance have also got a vested interest in procurement in saving money as much as possible, and where the process, if it's done correctly, it's not just a case of the solution working well and the pieces of tech interfacing. Often we see that actually there's a significant automation or time saving potential for finance, in that it can remove a lot of the work that they have to do when this isn't well structured, and therefore you get their buy-in because you're significantly improving their life and reducing the amount of engagement they have to do.
Yeah, I mean, when you put it like that, the involvement of finances, they should be one of the key drivers of putting these types of program in place, because ultimately they should be looking at what's happening in the business and saying, okay, we spent 150 million last year on services. What do we get for it? What were the projects? Who did them? What was the result? Was it on time, on budget? Which suppliers were we using? Are they doing a good job? And that's where they need to leverage procurement. But procurement need to be given the tools and the mandate to do the job to be able to provide that sort of information. So I do agree they are a crucial stakeholder. And I think quite often you'll see the decisions around these sorts of things sitting with, for example, the CFO in a lot of cases where they want to sign off a process.
Absolutely, and there's a large organisation that we've been working with. The first thing they did when COVID hit, the first sort of policy change that the CFO made, was he required all SoW contingency spend to come across his desk, and to receive his approval prior to any form of sort of market engagement, supplier engagement, whatever it may be. And there's two immediate things that stood out as a result of that. One of which is that process all had to happen by email because they hadn't stood up properly an SoW process. So there's a whole set of work where somebody who works in the CFO's office was collating it all off via email and collecting up all the information from business and doing a very manual process to put it in front of the CEO. The second thing is the number of requests dropped by 20%, because people don't necessarily want to immediately flag, to the CFO, by the way, I need to go and get this consultancy spend, unless they've clearly thought it through and have got a very clear case as to why they want to go down that route, because they know that's the sort of immediately questions they're going to come back. Why can't you do this internally? Why do we need to go to a third party? What outcome are you hoping to achieve? To our point on outcome.
Yeah, and it ties into what you mentioned earlier about resistance from the business. Ultimately there's keeping people happy with having to, whether they have to go through a process or not, or whether they have to get something signed off or not. But COVID has kind of push that into quite sharp focus, in the sense that for some organizations, they're going to say, look, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to toe the line on this, because for the survival of the business, we've got to get these things under control. So you may find that a bit annoying, but you're going to have to just get on with it. And you can see where these major market changes with factors like Brexit, I-35, COVID in particular, they just kind of put a different slant on it in terms of the business priority.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think with regards to corralling that, and as you say, in the situation just described, where that CFO was signing off all SOWs, was that literally at any level, or was it kind of like above above 10K or 100K or something like that?
It was any consultancy spend, and it wasn't even the signing off of the SOW. It was a signing off to go to market, and then a signing. It's essentially an approval to spend.
Yeah, I mean, we quite often see situations where if an SOW is going through at a certain level, organisations will say, okay, if it's over, 50K, that needs to go in front of the CFO, but other stuff might be signed off by a line manager, etc. But I think it's in the tail spend where there can be a lot of jiggery pokery. People getting around headcount freezes, disguised T&M. People are very good at breaking stuff down into smaller and smaller chunks to try and get it under the radar where they need to.
Absolutely.
But also that's where some of the small, innovative, agile suppliers sit as well, which I think is really crucial that organisations are more aware of them. Because if you're using one of the big consultancies, everyone's aware of them, and they're going to be a default choice in a lot of cases, which may be the right choice. It may not be the right choice, but if you don't have the data, you can't ascertain that. But there are these agile suppliers as well that need to be considered, and I think that's something that procurement departments are getting much hotter on.
Absolutely, and there's an organisation we're working with as well who've actually flipped that around, and I think actually rightly from a risk perception are saying actually the biggest IR35 risk is with the smaller suppliers who might be a one-man band or who might be more of a sort of hidden contractor versus your Accenture. If you go and hire Accenture, you haven't got an IR35 risk. That's clear. But if you hire, these are smaller contractors, then yes, it may be classified as consultancy, but it may well fall into IR35 scope if it's not properly defined. So that organisation has said anything under 100K is where they're going to start with their SOW spend, partly because procurement have said, if it's under 100K, we're not interested we haven't got the bandwidth to support it. We're focusing on the bigger pieces, which is interesting, but anyway, but also because of a perception, that's where potentially the biggest IR35 risk is as well.
Yeah, I think that's certainly very valid. And I think it also kind of reinforces the point I was making earlier that, getting away from that kind of headcount mentality, worker mentality of just kind of applying that across to SOW. It needs to start right at the beginning where you're saying this is not a role, this is a piece of work. And it's like, even when you look at things like rate cards, I think that's I find that a bit weird sometimes. Of course, it's got its place. But, if you're assessing Deloitte versus Accenture based on rate cards, to a certain extent, it's academic because one of them might take twice the amount of time to do the work than the other one.
Absolutely.
So I think, just really for organisations to take the view of, start point is what needs to get done. There are some innovative companies coming through at the moment that are helping, and obviously organisations that I'm sure you guys do as part of your service, help people define the work that they're trying to carry out. And we sometimes see in a scenario, if we're deploying for a client via an MSP, for example, via an intermediary, then the intermediary may well triage the statement of work when it comes through and actually add to it, help sign it off and all that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot that can be done around that. But if you get that right, you're a long way down the process to doing the rest of it correctly. But then you've still got to make sure that contracts are in place, workflows are followed, milestones are actually achieved, and also that the way that the work is carried out is consistent with what was agreed. So bearing IR35 in mind, people just have to come in line really, because otherwise they're going to be causing an unnecessary and unacceptable business risk. And I just don't think that's going to, kind of slide anymore.
Yeah, I totally agree. And maybe just to pick up on the point that you were making about the rate cards, yeah, I really agree. You can just looking at the rate, or if we want to call it in procurement language, the price in isolation, I think is a really poor way of looking at it. Just and particularly if you're looking at savings, just to say, we're just going to look at price and that's it in terms of savings. The client who I mentioned a while ago, who was scoring all of the consultancy providers, they always talk to them about a 40-40-20 approach when trying to manage and reduce the overall level of spend, of which only 20% was price in terms of trying to achieve a savings target. 40% was demand management and 40% was specification. So understanding, right at the front, why do you actually need it in this way? And why do you actually think you need this type of work or this type of supplier? and triaging that in that way with that type of mentality at the beginning was the biggest way they were able to reduce the overall spend rather than just purely looking at the actual price itself. So I totally agree with you. Rate cards is it's just one part of the piece and not necessarily a particularly important one.
Yeah, and ultimately, supplier comparison is complex and it's nuanced. You know, if you look at supplier comparison in goods and materials, it's far simpler. It's much more binary. You know, if you're buying 50 red widgets, you know, that's far simpler to say, yes, I got them, there were 50, they're of the agreed quality, and I got them on time at my 5 depots, for example, compared to a piece of consultancy. You know, it might be a major strategic piece of consultancy that's critical to the business. But when you're actually making the choice of which supplier you go to, if you look historically at the work you've had done by various different suppliers, it's a much more complicated scenario to try and compare them, because you can't compare project to project, because pretty much every project's different. It's something that I think I feel like that is like a future step, or it's not the first step right now. People just need to get the spend under control. They need to put the proper systems in place. They need to have the right processes in place. They need to use the right partners to help them manage this type of spend. They need to recognize the importance and execute a plan to manage this spend. But definitely there's huge scope for that supplier comparison piece. It's something we've been doing loads of work around with our SPX scoring system, where you're looking at various different metrics around suppliers, but it has to be qualitative and quantitative. But ultimately, you need the information stored within a system to be able to achieve that. But that's where you start getting to the really clever stuff, where not only can you retrospectively look at the performance of suppliers. Supplier X performed really well in this category. Why are we using him in that category? They've never performed well in that category. But also you can get more into the kind of strategic predictive side of it, where you could say this piece of work looks like it would be most effectively carried out by one of these 5 suppliers based on the information that we've already got. But I do think that's kind of a couple of steps further down the line.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, one of the things that stands out in terms of just that direction of travel that you've just articulated, and particularly when we're thinking about sort of innovation suppliers, one of the models that I'm starting to see emerge slightly, and this is driven by some of the tech platforms, is where you almost build up a marketplace of, let's call them consultants or consultants resources, and then whether it's sort of a service or whether it's a tech, you understand that there's a need for a project or a need for a piece of work, and then go and look at matching that against consultants who are in the marketplace, and bring those people together who it's going to be the first time they've worked together as a team. But that's also that could be true of a lot of the big consultancy suppliers anyway. But actually then saying, what we'll do is we will take ownership for the deliverable in terms of the client. And I remember go back 5-6 years ago, this was, I was pitched on this being a concept of somebody who was building a marketplace, and it was, it felt, oh, this is a great idea, but probably the market isn't quite ready now. And I wonder if in terms of who a supplier is going to change as a result of that. And with all the things that we've talked about, the sort of the acceleration of moving to outcome work as a result of IR35 and the other things we talk about, that model is something that could really come up. And again, that makes comparison on one level easier, because then you're comparing a team, say, from one of the consultancy suppliers versus a team of people or professionals that you pull together with a much lower markup. But it also makes it difficult in all the ways that you've outlined as well, in terms of trying to compare suppliers, which I guess is exactly why systems have evolved separate to sort of the general procurement system. It's one of the questions often asked. Well, why do you need a separate system compared to an Ariba or a Coupa that does the procurement for everything else? And the answer is because it's so complex and so nuanced that you can't just buy people in the same way that you buy goods and services. There's a lot of different variables and factors that have to be brought into play, and that's why there's a need for specialist systems to support that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And companies are much more comfortable with the idea of using best of breed technology for specific functions these days, and knitting it all together using, sensible, simple integrations, which are, much more common these days. And there's no reason why specific technologies can't kind of complement or enhance an overall, procure to pay or source to pay, it's kind of overall procurement system like an Ariba or a Coupa or an iValuer. but you can't expect one thing to do everything to the greatest, highest level. It's just not possible. And when you look at some of these big systems, it's a fast moving world now. It's the innovation happens so quickly. These systems are big. They've got big customers. They've been around for a while. It's so much more difficult for them to adapt as things change, which is where, their adaptability is based around their ability to integrate with new fast moving solutions that might be only fulfilling a particular part of the process, but they might be doing that very well. So I think people are much more open to it and I think there's a general understanding that, if you look at a lot of those big procurement systems, I feel like, my personal opinion is, I feel like they're more geared towards goods rather than services.
Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah.
But that's partly because the goods side of it is simpler, and it doesn't necessarily require something completely separate on its own. But it's also interesting what you were saying about the marketplace side. I mean, if you look at contingent workforce, the growth of marketplaces and contingent workforce is one thing, but also within larger organizations, the growth of the use of, for example, private talent pools is another aspect of it. And I think the same stands true when you look at services procurement, because organizations want to work with their suppliers. And in a lot of cases, they don't necessarily want more suppliers. They want to rationalize it to less suppliers, but they want to make sure they're working with the best suppliers and they've got great relationships with them. So I think that's where we're certainly seeing the appetite for these almost like private supplier populations for large organizations to manage, because they'll have specific contracts, specific onboarding criteria they want to work with particular organizations that would be different to the way that somebody else works with them. And that's where I think the marketplace model is difficult to transition across lots of big enterprises, because firstly, the marketplace has to define, has to choose the suppliers. They also have to define what a good supplier is. It's their marker of what a good supplier is. It's also down to them to say what onboarding requirements there are, whereas that's just not going to suit everybody in my experience. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but there's definitely lessons that can be learned from one to the other.
Yeah. It's interesting, sort of the concept of the private suppliers. And I agree, there's sort of the marketplace doesn't necessarily totally map across, because you've got that need to bring people together in a project, whereas on a contingent marketplace, it's always one for one, right? It's always a role to person. Whereas here, you're talking about one to many, and so I think that there's a lot of way for that could play out, those different sort of supplier marketplace models. It'll be interesting to see which direction they go.
Definitely. So going back to the kind of the ownership and the stakeholders involved in these type of services procurement programs. So obviously, clearly, there's a huge importance in the involvement of procurement. It's massively important that finance are involved in the process. Quite often operations need to be involved as part of this, and in some cases it's very relevant and it crosses over a lot with HR. But what are you seeing, and what is your opinion on where the kind of who's the ultimately responsible? Where do the stakeholders sit that should be driving this and managing this process?
Yeah, it's interesting. You've touched on HR. I'm struggling to think off the top of my head any of statement of work programs that have HR as the sole owner or the prime owner. In some cases they're involved, but when I first started in sort of my career in the contingent workforce industry, there was always a sort of like, are HR going to be involved in contingent? And in many cases, you would find HR departments saying, nope, not interested. That's totally gone out of the window now. And on many programs and many clients we work with, HR is a bigger stakeholder than procurement. And in some cases, you see procurement just involved whenever it comes to a contractual piece or KPIs or whatever it may be. The same is definitely not true for SoW. And I wonder if the industry is going to go on a similar direction of travel as HR sort of continue to see the number of permanent employees or the percentage of permanent employee population shrinking and want to get more involved in SoW. But in almost all cases, then the main owner is procurement. And I think the key thing for me comes on finance space, and I think that's critical. But what relationship do procurement have with the business? Or operations, or whatever term we want to come back to? Are they just seen as business police who just, you need to have a contract and it's got to have these terms and conditions in, and that's it? Or is it a function that is really going to add value to the business? in terms of helping them to think through what do they need, how do you qualify it, how do you find the right suppliers, and this is a problem I think that MSPs have struggled with in terms of their relationship with business and stakeholders, is being able to have that intimate knowledge, because there are so many different suppliers, being able to talk to a business or talk to a project manager sensibly about what the supplier landscape looks like for their particular area or for their particular project. And I think in many cases, procurement isn't necessarily able to do that and hasn't got the knowledge to do that. And so it'll be interesting to see, are there lots of will tools emerge that really give a market analysis of which suppliers might be a good fit for specific projects, or using a lot of the data that is out there to, I guess, arm procurement to have a more meaningful conversation with the business. And that's for me key to a successful management of SoW program, is where the business sort of see and recognize value that procurement brings beyond just being a tick box process and a painful exercise that they have to go through to get done whatever they need to get done, and they end up doing what they were going to do originally anyway, with maybe a few tweaks here and there. That's sort of where we see the sponsorship landscape at the moment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with regards to the importance of procurement in this process and their ability to add value. So going back to what you were saying there with regards to, processes happening, how can procurement understand the supplier landscape for a specific area? I kind of see it there's different points that they could get involved and add value there. So they could try and get involved up front and say, okay, you should be looking to select one from one of these 10 suppliers that I've taken from our supplier directory and looked at their historical information. Now that's the kind of point that companies want to get to. But right now, even if projects went through a competitive bidding process and suppliers that company is already in contact with were part of that bidding process, so relevant suppliers were included in a bidding process, if that information is captured and that data is available, then procurement can certainly get involved at the point that bids are starting to come in. Even if they're not coming, even if they can't provide those insights at the very upfront part, because as I say, that kind of comes later when you've got a more of a mature program. But there's a huge value in just doing that. As I said, value in just running a competitive bid process. Also, there's value in using supplier input to tailor the statement of work to the most effective way to get it done. Suppliers can come back and say, actually, you don't need those 6 milestones. We can do it in 4. Or actually, a more effective way to do it would be like this. This is the way that we would suggest you do it. And that may lead to revisions as you go through to the point of the work actually being agreed. But procurement can get involved in that kind of that bidding and buying process, where the business stakeholders might not have the time, but also they might have too close a relationship in some ways with some of the suppliers, so they can't necessarily get involved objectively. So therefore, it's very useful for them to be able to lean on procurement to say, "You guys sort that out for me. Go and have the battles. Go and have the kind of straight up conversations. Nail it down, and we'll work with the best supplier." So I think there's massive value. And there's the top-down value as well of the CFO being able to say, what did we spend? Who did we spend it with? What did they do? Did it work? Was it a good result? What did we get for the money? Should we ever do that again, or is that a lesson learned? So I think there's huge value, but I feel at the moment that there's an emerging recognition of the value of procurement. And I think with things like COVID and the economic climate we're likely to see over the next couple of years, that's going to grow. I don't know if you agree with that.
I would agree in terms of as a general rule, yes, absolutely. I think, procurement sort of maybe 10, 15 years ago was seen as a bit of sort of paper pushers and, tick box. I think there is more recognition of the value they can bring. And I agree with you, sort of the holy grail for procurement is being able to come and articulate the market landscape and provide insight that perhaps the business didn't know. But perhaps the most obvious starting point is, to your point, is, we can help you negotiate an SOW, and that's not just putting it, a basic set of terms and conditions, but actually helping you, to our earlier point about what is the right outcome and how do we structure this in the most meaningful way to get done what you need to get done. I think you're right. Procurement coming in at that point is I think the most likely point of entry where if they haven't been engaged before, and B, you can add some value without having to break the supplier manager relationship.
So say if we take a scenario where you've got a services procurement category manager and a business stakeholder that wants to get a piece of work done. In most cases, how much value do you think that category manager could add at the point of creating the requirement? do you think in most cases they could add a lot of value just by using sensible general procurement practices to say, you need to be talking about this, you need to bottom out what's going to happen with, timings, delivery, if there's anything else associated with it? Do you think, or do you think that in most cases the understanding of the requirement is so specific that it makes it hard to apply those general principles? Or do you think you can kind of contemplate that to a certain extent where procurement could help on every requirement?
I think for the majority of cases, it would be the former, that procurement should be able to come in and add value in terms of, have you thought about this? What's the exit plan for the supplier? Are we going to do a handover of IP in terms of what are they creating? How's that going to help our sort of our ongoing capability? Are there resources that we can talk about? What type of resources are we needing? Do we even have those type of resources internally before we go externally? Is this supplier all contracted? I think there is definitely in the vast majority of cases, and maybe there's some very technical where that might be too niche, but in general, I would strongly advocate for procurement should be able to add value at that point, as you've articulated.
Yeah, because I feel it's logical to say that they don't need to know the detail, don't need to understand the detail of everything of a very complicated IT project, but the fundamental principles of what a requirement needs to contain will follow throughout. So it's going to be interesting to see how this kind of pans out over the next few months. Obviously, hell of a lot going on, particularly in the UK. Be interesting to see. I feel like the UK is going to take a step ahead of the rest of the world because it's being forced to around outcome-based and managing SOW. I know there's quite a lot going on in the US. I mean, obviously, some of the laws around disguised employment, particularly in places like California, are mirroring things like R35 pretty closely. I know there's similar stuff going on in places like Belgium and the Netherlands as well, to a certain extent. But I do feel like the UK is going to get a bit of a head start on this, or be forced to take a bit of a lead on this. What do you think in terms of what you expect to see in 2021? What sort of kind of timescales, and obviously we've got the clear inflection points of Brexit in January, I-35 in April, but what do you expect to see in terms of a kind of process over the course of 2021?
Well, I think, I'll come on to that in a minute. I just wanted to touch on your point about the UK almost being forced to go ahead, and I agree with that. And it's easy for us to sit here in the UK and say, yeah, we're going to be the first. But what's interesting is, the UK government is themselves looking at it. So recently, there's some details leaked, but they're looking at sort of establishing almost their in-house consultancy provider, Crown Consultancy. It was on the front page of the papers a few weeks ago, where saying actually, we I can't remember what the figure was, but we spend a huge amount with external consultancies across government. We need to understand what that is, because we think we're spending far too much money, and let's start articulating what, to the point the questions you ask about the CFO, who are we spending with, what are we spending it, why are we using them, and should we be using those suppliers in the first place? It's a big if, because it's a government, but if they truly move that on in terms of almost saying we're going to have almost like an in-house MSP for managing SOW spend across all key government departments, that I think becomes a very significant game changer for the general SOW model in the UK, and that's sort of something that a lot of people can follow, and a lot of in the sector as a template. So that it's very early stages, and there was only a few details that were made public. So who knows which direction that goes in and which way they go. But the fact that government is really, it's front and center of the government thinking, I think plays to your point about this being the UK having to go ahead in a lot of this area. Where do we think? I think 2021 will go. I think very little will happen between now and April. You thought it was almost a dry one that we had last year, this year rather, that organizations would prepare themselves and would be really prepared. I'm not convinced that's the case from organizations that we talk to. I think a lot of people, the minute it was postponed, have stopped whatever work they were doing and put it on the back burner, particularly with COVID. So I think there's going to be a lot of scrambling in the sort of the first few months after April, after it goes live. And it'll be interesting to see which models or which engagement models. I think there's already been some form of shift anyway to sort of more statement of work, but I think it's not necessarily truly outcome. And I think that's going to be there'll almost be a staging point where we have to switch to SOW, and there'll be some switch to SOW, and then it will be pretty quickly questions will start being asked. Okay, is this actually truly a real SOW? And then that will trigger a lot of I think, organizations to think more meaningfully about how do we structure this correctly, and how do we move to more thinking about outcomes rather than just as an alternative engagement model to PSC contractors.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel like I feel like companies are more likely to be prepared earlier than they were for last April. You know, even if I look at this period now compared to the same time last year, you know, we were still waiting for the election. So, you know, to a certain extent, people were saying, is IR35 even going to happen? What if, you know, if the Conservatives don't get in, then is that going to change things? So I think there was a lot of stuff that was kind of hanging around, whereas now it feels more definite, although obviously, you know, with COVID, everything feels uncertain to a degree. So yeah, I think what you're saying makes complete sense. What you're saying about the government approach, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. And you know, ultimately, if the government are kind of precipitating this type of action through IR35, and obviously these changes have taken place in the public sector already, 2-3 years ago. Yeah, that's very interesting. If the government really fully get on board with it, then I think that's just going to drive the change even faster. And it's just going to change working practices generally. As I said before, it's still always horses for courses. There's always going to be, you know, the right scenarios to use contractors, the right scenarios where it needs to be permanent employees, and the right scenarios where it should be outcome-based deliverables. But I do feel like the factors we're experiencing at the moment, and the world is obviously experiencing COVID, that's just driving so much change in a lot of areas. And like you made with the example about remote working, it's just changed work massively. I saw a graph the other day of the increase in the number of people who now have a dog, and it would restrict them from being able to work from an office. It's like the true metric of whether people are going to be going back to working from an office or not. But there's all these kind of factors that, you know, have just changed and just become different, and how many of them will remain, and how many of them, you know, obviously got vaccines coming through now. How many of them will then just flip back to how they were, or how long that'll take. But generally, when you get these kind of major events, technological change happens very, very quickly. It forces that, like the use of, for example, Zoom. I think it's going to be really, really interesting. And yeah, I think there'll be some positive change, hopefully, that really comes out of it. When you look at some of the stuff that's already going on, that's just totally disorganized and kind of all a bit too much in the grey areas, I think it will just make things more organised, because people will have to be, and it should have benefits for big suppliers and small suppliers, and for organisations, because it just means everybody has to do everything properly, or to a much greater degree. Yeah, certainly going to be interesting. Any further thoughts in terms of what you're expecting for 2021?
Well, I think IR35 will definitely happen, because I think that's always, you know, I look at what the government's saying about.
Are you sure?
You look at what the government's saying about the state of the economy, hints that they need to raise taxes potentially in the future. I struggle to see them walking away from this in terms of this being an income source at this point. So I'd put more money on it than, yeah, I'd be very confident. In terms of what I think it will. What will be really interesting is what it will do to a lot of, and let's say particularly IT, you know, recruitment, because that's where a lot of there's, you know, obviously the biggest area of traditionally and historically PSC contractors. I think there's going to be a shake-up in that sort of industry, in the IT recruitment industry, of which ones are going to move to the new engagement models, and who's going to be able to create something truly differential and market leading. That's going to be something for me to watch in terms of that. Perhaps of all of the areas of contractors, the biggest area of impact, and will probably have to be the first movers in terms of moving more towards these models. So there could be some form of convergence between typical provision of IT resources and some of the, you know, the big IT outsourced large-scale providers of, you know, the Cognizants, the Wipros, the Syntels. There'll probably be some sort of convergence between those two ends of the stick, and what that looks like will be really interesting to see.
What about the potential for recruiters to offer kind of project and consulting services and move up the value chain? Is that something you think we might see as well?
So my reference points for this is looking at how have MSPs, and the vast majority of MSPs have come out of recruitment backgrounds and recruitment consultancies. It's a very hard leap to make to really truly structuring a procurement program in all of the ways that we've talked about. If you're bringing in people whose background is recruiting, it's just a totally different mentality, to your point, and a different skill set. And I think that's also been frankly, one of the reasons that a lot of organizations have struggled to adopt it, because the MSPs haven't necessarily been, and there's some exceptions to that, but necessarily been able to truly articulate a procurement mentality around the statement of work program. So I struggle to see organizations making that jump. And I think the other big thing is, what will truly add value to a client is taking ownership of the deliverable or taking ownership of the milestone. And I see many organizations struggling to sort of, from a risk and liability perspective, wanting to sign up for that and adjust their engagement models that much, where they're going to need to take that in, because it will still remain price competitive, but a lot of organizations will want to price that risk in of having to do that, and I think that will remove a lot of them from being able to make that leap.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting dynamic to watch, because I think I take on board what you say about the difficulty in transitioning and the gap that there is. But we're certainly seeing some organisations who are setting up, almost like sub-organisations where they're recruiting people who, purely from a procurement background. It's very divorced from the kind of general recruitment operations, but they're just trying to leverage their access to expertise and their access into customers and just fill a different slot on the value chain. But I think we're going to see all sorts of different kind of operating models coming up and bubbling up and around in 2021. So it should be very interesting. And I think there's going to be lots of opportunities as companies look to move forward and do things in a different way, because there are clear drivers that mean they have to make changes. Whereas otherwise, where you look at models like outcome-based, I mean, it's already massive. SoW spend or services spend is something like 4 times the size of contingent workforce in most organizations.
Absolutely, yeah.
But the recognition of it and the sophistication is behind something like contingent workforce at the moment. But I think that's definitely going to change. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting year ahead. Anyway, listen, I really appreciate your time. That's been a fascinating conversation. Some great insights from you. Really, really appreciate your point of view. And yeah, good luck with everything. And yeah, hopefully speak to you again soon. But thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. I've really enjoyed the conversation. So thanks, and have a good day.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Tim.
Cheers. Bye-bye.